Some real estate agents will tell you to never allow your clients to enter into a temporary occupancy agreement. But I'm sure you've heard that saying, never say never. It certainly applies to temporary occupancy agreements because sometimes they just can't be avoided. My name is Sharon Smoot. I'm a realtor and a closing attorney in the metro Atlanta area. And today I want to talk to you about temporary occupancy agreements when the seller needs to remain in the property after closing. But if you're in another state, I encourage you to pull the forms for temporary occupancy of the seller after closing and temporary occupancy of the buyer before closing. And in your state, it might just be one form. In Georgia, there are two separate forms. When the buyer needs to occupy the property prior to closing, that is GAR Form F219. When the seller needs to occupy the property after closing, that is Form F219. And whether you are representing the buyer or the seller in a situation where the seller needs to occupy the property after closing, it is important that you understand what that temporary occupancy agreement says. So the first thing that it says is how long the seller is going to occupy the property after closing. You might think, okay, no big deal. The seller says they need 75 days, but that can be a big deal. And here's the reason why. If the buyer is financing their loan or financing the purchase, they're getting FHA or VA financing, their loan documents say that they have to take possession within 60 days of the closing date. If the buyer is getting conventional financing and they're an owner-occupant, their loan documents say that they've got to take possession of the property within 60 days of closing. So that's one key provision that you have to keep in mind. And the seller needs to be prepared to move out of that property within 60 days. But here's the kicker. Do you want to fill in 60 days? Remember, the buyer has to take possession within 60 days. So if the seller is vacating on the 60th day, how can the buyer take possession on the 60th day? So here's a pro tip for you. Fill in 59 days or 58 days just to create a little bit of a buffer so that the seller can be out and the buyer can be in within that 60-day period. So I want to talk about the next two provisions of the F219 in conjunction with one another. And those have to do with damage to the property and responsibility for making repairs. So what you need to know is that the F219 says that the seller is responsible for any damage caused by the seller, the seller's family, licensees, or invitees beyond normal wear and tear. That's really, really critical because if the seller's going to live in the property for a month or two after closing, there may be some scratches to the wall or a spill on the carpet. And those things are considered normal wear and tear. I would like to believe that if a seller is going to occupy the property after closing, that they are going to take great pains not to be scratching up the walls and not to be spilling stuff on the carpet, or to at least clean the carpet if there is a spill. But those types of things are considered normal wear and tear. However, if maybe when the movers are there, there is a hole made in the walls, or the seller's son is playing ball in the house and breaks a window, things like that are not considered normal wear and tear. So the seller would be responsible for repairing those types of damage. Now, when we talk about systems, this is the buyer's house now. So the buyer is responsible for making repairs to any of the systems, whether we're talking HVAC, the roof, electrical, plumbing, anything like that. Those repairs are the responsibility of the buyer. So in my opinion, it's very important that the parties are clear as to the condition of the property on the date of closing. Now, we all know that the purchase and sale agreement says that the seller has to deliver the property to the buyer in substantially the same condition that it was in when the parties went under contract. So it is critically important when there is going to be temporary occupancy by the seller after closing that the buyer do a final walkthrough, because the buyer wants to make sure that between the time that they went under contract and the date of closing, that nothing has changed as far as the condition of the property. And you might think, well, they'd want to do that anyway, even if there was no temporary occupancy after closing going to happen. But sometimes when there is going to be temporary occupancy by the seller after closing, the buyer might elect to forego doing that final walkthrough because they're thinking, well, I'm not going to take possession immediately, so I really don't need to do a walkthrough. But they do, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you're unsure. Was any damage done between the time you went under contract and the closing date? Is there something that you missed when you initially looked at the property? So yes, please make sure that your clients do a final walkthrough, especially when there's going to be temporary occupancy by the seller after closing. Now, another provision of the temporary occupancy agreement that is really, really important is the proration. The temporary occupancy agreement says that if the seller has not vacated the property on the specified date, 58 days, 59 days, whatever the parties agree to, they will pay a per diem. Now, how do you calculate that per diem? In my opinion, it is best to calculate it based on the mortgage payment or a number in the range of the mortgage payment. And I'm going to give you an example in just a little bit. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the seller has to maintain homeowner's insurance to protect the structure. The buyer should maintain renter's insurance to protect their personal belongings in the event of fire or other natural disaster, in the event that the home is broken into and the buyer's stuff gets stolen, what have you. One thing that I think is really, really interesting about the F219 is that it is silent on how much the seller has to pay the buyer for the privilege of occupying the property after closing. That's kind of strange, right? If you don't know what you're doing and you allow your client to sign that temporary occupancy agreement and you're representing the buyer, they might come back at some point and say, hey, I got screwed. The seller has lived in my house for almost 2 months and I haven't gotten a dime. That doesn't seem quite fair, right? One thing that I think is really, really interesting about the F219 is that it is silent on how much the seller has to pay the buyer for the privilege of occupying the property after closing. That's kind of strange, right? If you don't know what you're doing and you allow your client to sign that temporary occupancy agreement and you're representing the buyer, they might come back at some point and say, hey, I got screwed. The seller has lived in my house for almost 2 months and I haven't gotten a dime. That doesn't seem quite fair, right? So that's when your special stipulations come into play. You might want to draft a special stipulation that specifies how much how much the seller is going to pay the buyer for the privilege of occupying the buyer's house after closing. And don't get it twisted, it is the buyer's house after closing. So how do you draft that special stipulation? You're not going to want to use anything that references the seller paying the buyer's mortgage. The lender is not going to like that language. They're going to want to see language that says that the seller shall pay buyer X number of dollars per day for X number of days. So let's just make it simple. And this is an example from a closing that I had recently. The buyer's mortgage payment is $3,000 a month. Divide that $3,000 by 30 days, that gets you $100. So the special stip in the F219 said that the seller was going to pay the buyer $100 a day for 59 days as a part of the rent back. Easy peasy. The lender was like, great, that's just the language that we're looking for. No problems. Now, in that same transaction, we negotiated the terms of the contract, including the temporary occupancy agreement. We settled on the amount. Due diligence goes by. Appraisal contingency goes by. Financing contingency goes by. And the lender came back and asked us to tweak that language regarding how much was going to be paid. So the buyer's agent redrafted that language. But what did she do? She adds a provision that says that my seller would pay a security deposit of, oh, how much did she say? I think she wanted, wow, how soon we forget. I think it was for another $3,000 maybe? 3,000 or 6,000. I can't remember what it was. Now, I put my foot down. I told my client, under no uncertain terms should you agree to this. And there were a couple reasons for it. Number one, my client had put $50,000 into the house. So she was like, there's no way that I'm doing anything to tear this house up. And, I don't even understand why they would be asking this at this juncture. Number two, and really more importantly, is that the request was not timely. This is something that should have been negotiated on the front end, but to just add a provision into the contract, that just wouldn't fly. And I told my client the same thing. Like, there is no way that you are required to do this. And the buyer is not in a position where they can walk away without losing their earnest money. You don't need to do it. And more importantly, or just as importantly, the temporary occupancy agreement already says that you, seller, are responsible for any damage that you do to the property. So requiring a security deposit isn't necessary. Could you do it? Yeah. If it was requested or negotiated early on, but to be just, I don't know, a week and a half away from closing and to think that you're going to add this provision, no. So my client was in agreement. She didn't want to do it. The buyer's agent comes back and says, my client is concerned. What recourse does he have if your client damages the property? And I'm like, his recourse would be to go to small claims court. But, there's nothing that requires my client to agree to this at this point. Might the buyer have had more leverage if this request had been made after we went under contract, but before the due diligence period expired? Yeah, because then he could have terminated the contract during the due diligence period if my client refused to pay a security deposit. And as long as he terminated before expiration of the due diligence period, he would have gotten his earnest money back. Another possibility, Could have been that he made this request for a security deposit during the due diligence period, and the inspection report came back and said that there were so many things wrong with the house. Again, he could have terminated for any reason. Maybe in his mind, the reason is because the seller refused to pay the security deposit, but he didn't have to disclose that because he was still in his due diligence period. So if you're in a situation where your client, the buyer, wants the protections of a security deposit, that is something that really needs to be negotiated on the front end. You don't want to wait until a week or so before closing to ask for that, because at that point, your client has no leverage. And if your client decides to terminate because the seller refuses to pay that security deposit, then your client is going to lose their earnest money. The only thing that could happen that would allow them to get their earnest money back is if the appraisal comes in low and the seller refuses to reduce the sales price, or their loan gets denied before expiration of the financing contingency period. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that you've covered all your bases before you submit the offer, so that anything that might be a sticking point can be negotiated on the front end. I keep saying front end. If you're still with me at this point, just type front end so that I know you're still listening or watching. So I think that's it for this video. If you have any questions about temporary occupancy agreements, feel free to drop them in the comments. And I just want to close by saying this. I did a video about temporary occupancy agreements when the buyer needs to take possession early. And that's going to appear in this area momentarily. But one of the things that I said at the beginning of that video is that as real estate professionals, our primary responsibility is to protect our clients. And our next responsibility, our next most important responsibility, is to protect our brokerages and ourselves. And when you're doing the first one, you're automatically doing the second one. So just keep in mind when you encounter situations, especially situations that you've never been in before, read the documents, read them thoroughly. And if you're not sure how to proceed, reach out to your broker, reach out to another more experienced agent, reach out to your preferred closing attorney, but get the answers that you need so that you can properly counsel your client and so that you can adequately protect them. So I hope you found this video informative. If you have any questions about it, drop them in the comments, and I will see you again real soon for another video. Take care.